The smoke alarm's piercing shriek cut through the morning silence like a blade through silk. Elena Martinez rushed down the narrow hallway of her childhood home, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floors, the acrid smell of burning paper filling her nostrils. But when she reached the backyard, what she saw made her legs buckle beneath her. Her mother, Patricia, stood beside a metal trash can, flames dancing wickedly inside it, casting orange shadows across her weathered face. Thick black smoke billowed upward, carrying with it fragments of memories that would never return. Elena's wedding album lay open beside the can, its white leather cover singed at the edges, half its pages already feeding the hungry fire. "What have you done?" Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat constricting as she watched another page curl and blacken in the flames. Patricia turned, her dark eyes blazing with the same intensity as the fire she'd created. "I did what needed to be done, mija. That man doesn't deserve to be remembered in this house." Elena stumbled forward, reaching desperately into the flames before the heat drove her back. Her hands came away empty, palms red and stinging. The photographs, 4 years of professional wedding photography, candid moments captured by guests, the artistic shots that had taken her breath away when she first saw them, were nothing but ash now, floating away on the morning breeze like gray snow. "Those weren't just pictures of David," Elena choked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Those were pictures of me, of my day, of the happiest moment of my life." But even as she spoke, Elena knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. The happiest moment of her life had ended 6 months ago when she discovered David's affair, when she found the hotel receipts and the text messages, when her marriage of 3 years crumbled like paper in flames. Still, those photographs had been hers. They had belonged to her story, not just his. Patricia's expression softened slightly, but her jaw remained set. "You're better off without reminders of him, Elena. Trust me, I know what it's like to hold on to things that only bring pain." Elena sank to her knees beside the dying fire, watching the last recognizable image, a close-up of her bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, disappear forever. She remembered that moment, remembered how the photographer had knelt beside her, adjusting the flowers just so, how the late afternoon light had filtered through the church windows, how everything had felt so perfect, so permanent. The photographer. Elena's breath caught in her throat as a memory surfaced through her grief. Marcus Chen, the soft-spoken man who had followed her and David around for 12 hours on their wedding day, capturing not just the pose shots, but the in-between moments, her grandmother's tears during the ceremony, David's nervous laugh as he waited at the altar, the way Elena's dress had pooled around her feet like spilled moonlight. She remembered how Marcus had pressed an extra business card into her hand at the end of the reception, how he'd mentioned something about keeping the digital files for several years, about potential licensing opportunities. She'd barely listened then, too caught up in the joy of the day to focus on business details. But now, as she stared at the smoldering remains of her wedding album, those words echoed in her mind with new urgency. "The photographer," Elena whispered, scrambling to her feet. "Mom, the photographer might still have copies." Patricia frowned, using a long stick to poke at the remaining papers in the fire. "What photographer?" "Marcus Chen. He shot the wedding. Professional photographers always keep digital backups." Elena's voice grew stronger as hope flickered to life in her chest. "He gave me his card, said something about keeping files for 5 years or something." "Elena," Patricia said gently, her anger seeming to deflate as she watched her daughter's desperate expression, "even if he has copies, what's the point? Why torture yourself with reminders of that pendejo?"
But Elena was already moving, already thinking. She remembered Marcus mentioning his studio, something about it being in the arts district downtown. She remembered his quiet professionalism, the way he'd seemed to understand the importance of capturing not just images, but emotions, stories, entire worlds within frame of a single photograph. As she headed back toward the house, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window, her dark hair tangled from sleep, her face streaked with tears and soot, her oversized t-shirt hanging loose over pajama shorts. She looked like exactly what she was, a 32-year-old woman living back in her childhood bedroom after her marriage fell apart, watching her mother destroy the last tangible pieces of a life she'd once thought would last forever. But beneath the grief and shock, something else was stirring, a determination she hadn't felt since the day she'd finally confronted David about his infidelity, since the day she'd packed her bags and walked out of their shared apartment without looking back. Marcus Chen might have those photographs, and if he did, Elena was going to get them back. She grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter, her fingers shaking as she searched for a Chen photography. The website loaded slowly on her cracked screen, showing a portfolio of wedding images that made her chest tighten with recognition. There was his style, the natural lighting, the candid moments, the way he captured people when they thought no one was watching. The studio address was listed at the bottom of the contact page, 1247 Industrial Avenue, Suite 12. Elena knew the area, a converted warehouse district where artists and photographers had set up shop in the old factory spaces. It was only a 20-minute drive from her mother's house in East LA. "I'm going to find him," Elena announced, already heading toward the stairs to get dressed. Patricia followed her, concern creasing her features. "Elena, mija, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe it's better to just let sleeping dogs lie." But Elena was already pulling clothes from her suitcase. The same suitcase she'd been living out of for the past 6 months. The same suitcase that had become a symbol of her inability to move forward, to find a new place of her own, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her marriage. "Those photos were mine," Elena said firmly, pulling on jeans and a clean sweater. "Whatever happened between me and David, those pictures were of my wedding day. They were my memories to keep or destroy, not yours." The words hung in the air between them, sharper than Elena had intended. She saw her mother flinch, saw the hurt flash across Patricia's weathered face, before being replaced with defensive anger. "I was trying to protect you," Patricia said quietly. "I watched you cry over those pictures every night for months. I watched you flip through that album like you were torturing yourself." Elena paused in pulling on her boots, struck by the truth in her mother's words. She had been torturing herself, spending hours poring over wedding photos, searching the faces for signs of David's deception, wondering if she'd been blind to ignore the clues that must have been there all along. But that didn't give Patricia the right to make the choice for her. "I know you meant well," Elena said softly, standing and grabbing her car keys from the dresser. "But I need to try to get them back. I need to know if it's possible." As she headed for the door, Elena caught sight of family photos lining the hallway walls. Her high school graduation, Patricia's wedding to Elena's father 25 years ago, Christmas mornings and birthday parties, all the moments that make up a life. Her own wedding photo had hung here too, she and David smiling radiantly in their formal portrait, until she'd taken it down the day she moved back home. Now, all of it was gone, reduced to ash in a metal trash can in the backyard. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to save at least some of those memories. Maybe Marcus Chen's quiet professionalism extended to keeping detailed digital archives. Maybe there was still hope.
Elena stepped out into the bright Los Angeles morning, the smell of smoke still clinging to her clothes, her mother's worried voice calling after her from the doorway. She didn't know what she would find at Chen Photography, didn't know if Marcus would even remember her wedding from 3.5 years ago, didn't know if the files still existed. But she had to try. Those photographs represented more than just her failed marriage. They represented a day when she had felt beautiful and loved and hopeful about the future. They represented her grandmother's proud tears, her college friends' joyful faces, her father's awkward but heartfelt speech at the reception. They represented a version of herself that she wasn't ready to let disappear completely into ash and regret. As Elena drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past the corner market where she'd bought candy as a child, past the park where she played soccer in high school, past all the landmarks of a life that felt simultaneously hers and foreign, she found herself thinking about Marcus Chen. She remembered how he'd moved through her wedding day like a shadow, capturing moments without intruding on them, how he'd seemed to understand the weight of what he was documenting. Professional photographers were artists, weren't they? They understood the value of images, the way a single photograph could contain entire stories, entire worlds. Maybe he would understand why these pictures mattered to her, why they were worth fighting for even after everything had fallen apart.
The morning traffic was light as Elena made her way toward downtown, the industrial district spreading out before her like a maze of converted warehouses and artist studios. She found Industrial Avenue easily enough, but as she drove slowly down the street, searching for number 1247, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. Half the buildings looked abandoned, their windows boarded up or broken. Several bore for lease signs that had clearly been there for years, the paint faded and peeling. The arts district that had seemed so vibrant and promising a few years ago now looked like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. When Elena finally found 1247, her heart sunk completely. The building was clearly empty, its windows dark, a large space available banner stretched across the front entrance. She parked anyway, walking up to peer through the grimy windows, hoping against hope that she might see some sign of life inside. The space was completely vacant, nothing but concrete floors and exposed pipes, industrial lighting fixtures hanging like dead flowers from the ceiling. There was no trace that Chen Photography had ever existed here, no forwarding address, no clue about where Marcus might have gone. Elena stood there for a long moment, staring into the empty space, feeling the last flicker of hope die in her chest. Of course it was too late. Of course Marcus was long gone, probably moved to a different city or given up photography altogether. Of course her mother's fire had destroyed the last copies of those images, leaving nothing but ash and regret. But as Elena turned to walk back to her car, she noticed something that made her pause. Painted on the brick wall beside the entrance, almost hidden by years of weather and graffiti, was a small logo, a stylized camera with MC Photo written beneath it in elegant script. Marcus Chen. MC Photo. He had been here. The evidence was faint but real, like a ghost's signature on a wall. Elena pulled out her phone and searched for MC Photo Los Angeles, scrolling through results that led to dead links and expired domains. She tried Marcus Chen Photographer and found a few old wedding listings, but nothing current, nothing that would help her track him down. Standing in that empty parking lot, surrounded by the ruins of the arts district, Elena felt the full weight of her losses crashing down on her. Her marriage, her home, her sense of self, and now these photographs. All of it gone, all of it irretrievable. The fire her mother had lit in the backyard seemed to be spreading, consuming everything Elena had once thought permanent and precious. But somewhere in the depths of her despair, a small voice whispered that maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe Marcus Chen was still out there somewhere, still keeping digital files in cloud storage or external drives. Maybe professional ethics or simple sentimentality had kept them from deleting those wedding photos, even after all these years.
Elena looked back at the empty building one more time, memorizing the faded logo on the wall, the way the morning light fell across the broken pavement. She didn't know how she was going to find Marcus Chen, didn't know if it was even possible, but she knew she had to try. Those photographs were more than just images. They were proof that she had once been happy, that she had once believed in forever, that she had once been a bride full of hope and joy. And that version of herself, however naive and trusting she might have been, deserved to be remembered. The drive back to her mother's house felt endless, every red light giving Elena more time to think about what she'd lost and what she needed to do next. She parked in the driveway behind Patricia's ancient Honda Civic, noting the way the paint was starting to peel around the wheel wells, the small dent in the rear bumper from when her mother had backed into Mrs. Rodriguez's fence last Christmas. Everything in this neighborhood seemed to be slowly deteriorating, including Elena herself. Patricia was waiting in the kitchen when Elena walked in, a cup of café con leche steaming on the counter beside a plate of fresh pan tostado. The peace offering was so typically her mother, gestures of care wrapped around an unwillingness to directly apologize. "No luck?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she'd expected this outcome. Elena sank into one of the mismatched kitchen chairs, the same chair she'd done homework at as a teenager, the same table where she'd announced her engagement to David 4 years ago. Patricia had been skeptical then, too, had asked careful questions about David's job, his family, his intentions. Elena had brushed off her mother's concerns as old-fashioned worry, certain that love would conquer any obstacles. How wrong she had been about so many things. "The studio's gone," Elena said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Building's completely empty. Has been for a while, from the looks of it." Patricia settled into the chair across from her, her own cup cradled in hands that showed the wear of 30 years cleaning other people's houses. "Maybe it's for the best, mija. Maybe it's time to focus on what's ahead of you instead of what's behind you." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to explain why those photographs mattered, but she could see the exhaustion in her mother's eyes. Patricia had been carrying Elena's grief alongside her own struggles for 6 months now, watching her daughter cycle through the stages of heartbreak like a woman trapped in an emotional washing machine. Anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and back to anger again. "I called in sick for work," Elena said, pulling out her phone. "I need to spend today trying to track down the photographer." Patricia's expression tightened. Elena had been working temp jobs since the divorce. Nothing steady, nothing with benefits or a future. The marketing career she had built before marrying David had evaporated when she'd moved to follow his job, and starting over at 32 felt overwhelming when she could barely manage to get out of bed most mornings. "Elena, you can't keep calling in sick every time something happens. That agency won't keep sending you assignments if you're unreliable." "I know." Elena stared into her coffee, seeing her distorted reflection in the dark surface. "But this is important, Mom. Those photographs, they're not just about David, they're about me too, about who I was before everything fell apart." The woman in those wedding photographs had been confident, radiant, full of dreams about the future. She had a plan. Marriage, children, maybe buying a house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes like her grandmother used to. She imagined family holidays, anniversary celebrations, growing old with someone who loved her completely.
That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Elena had lost along with everything else. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Patricia said quietly. "I see my daughter, who graduated summa cum laude from UCLA. I see the girl who organized the neighborhood watch when Mrs. Chen's house was broken into. I see the woman who held my hand through your father's cancer treatment and never once complained about the hospital bills." Elena's throat tightened. Her father had died 2 years ago, 6 months before she discovered David's affair. The grief had come in waves, losing her father, then losing her marriage, then losing any sense of who she was supposed to be without these anchoring relationships. "That woman doesn't feel real anymore," Elena admitted. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. I feel like I'm just floating, like I lost Elena somewhere along the way and I don't know how to get her back." Patricia reached across the table and covered Elena's hand with her own. "You're still here, mija. You're just hurt. Hurt people do things that don't make sense, like spending hours staring at pictures of a man who broke your heart." Elena pulled her hand away gently. "But that's just it. They weren't just pictures of him. They were photos of Abuela crying during the ceremony. Remember how proud she was? And the picture of you and me getting ready that morning when you helped me with my veil. Those moments were real, even if the marriage wasn't." The memory hit Elena like a physical blow. Her grandmother had died 8 months ago, 2 months after Elena moved back home. Abuela Rosta had lived to see Elena's divorce finalized, had held Elena's hand and whispered that she was proud of her granddaughter for choosing herself over a man who didn't deserve her love. Now all the photographs of Abuela at the wedding were gone too, ashes floating in the morning breeze. Elena pushed back from the table abruptly, unable to sit still with the weight of these losses pressing down on her chest. She began pacing the small kitchen, her steps echoing the restless energy that had been driving her for months. "I need to find him," Elena said, more to herself than to Patricia. "Marcus Chen. There has to be a way to track him down." She spent the next hour on her laptop, searching every combination of keywords she could think of. Marcus Chen, photographer, Los Angeles. MC photo. Wedding photography, Industrial Avenue. Chen photography, Los Angeles archives. Most of the results led to dead ends, but Elena found a few breadcrumbs: an old Yelp listing with reviews from 2019 and 2020, a mention in a community photography blog about emerging artists in the warehouse district, and a brief interview in a local newspaper about small business struggles during the pandemic. The interview was the most promising lead. Marcus had talked about the challenges of maintaining a photography business when weddings were canceled, about pivoting to portrait work and commercial assignments. He'd mentioned having to give up his studio space but continuing to work from a home office. The article was from 2 years ago, but it was something. Elena screenshotted the relevant passages and kept digging, eventually finding Marcus's old Instagram account. The last post was 18 months ago. A black and white portrait of an elderly man playing chess in a park, accompanied by a caption about finding beauty in everyday moments. The account showed his evolution as an artist, from traditional wedding photography to more artistic documentary-style work. Elena scrolled through years of images, recognizing his distinctive style, the way he captured light and shadow, the emotional honesty of his portraits, the gentle intimacy of his approach. And then she found it. Buried deep in his Instagram feed, posted 4 years ago, was a single image from her wedding. Not one of the formal poses, but a candid shot he'd taken during the reception. Elena laughed at something her college roommate had whispered in her ear, her head thrown back in genuine joy, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the reception hall windows and catching the beads on her dress. She remembered that moment. Sarah had made a joke about David's dancing, something affectionately teasing about his 2 left feet. Elena had felt so carefree in that instant, so surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of a beautiful future. Looking at the photograph now, Elena felt a complex mix of emotions: pain at the reminder of what she'd lost, but also a strange kind of relief. Here was proof that those moments of joy had existed, that they hadn't been completely imaginary or naive. She had been genuinely happy once, genuinely hopeful, genuinely loved, at least by her friends and family, if not ultimately by David. The photo had 17 likes and 3 comments, all from other photographers praising Marcus's work. Elena clicked on his profile information, but there was no current contact information, no website link that worked, no clues about where he might be now. But the photo existed, on the internet, in Marcus's Instagram feed, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. It wasn't the complete wedding album, but it was something. It was proof that not everything had been lost to her mother's fire. Elena screenshotted the image, then went back to searching. If Marcus was still active on social media, even sporadically, there might be other ways to reach him. She tried Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, even TikTok, but found nothing recent. By early afternoon, Elena's eyes were burning from staring at the computer screen, and her shoulders ached from hunching over the laptop. Patricia had gone to work. She cleaned houses for 3 families in the wealthier neighborhoods, leaving before dawn and returning exhausted in the late afternoon. Elena made herself a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the backyard where the metal trash can still sat like an accusation. The fire had burned out hours ago, leaving nothing but a pile of gray ash that stirred occasionally in the breeze. She needed to think differently about this problem. Marcus Chen was out there somewhere, probably still taking photographs, probably still maintaining digital archives of his work. The question was how to find him when all his public-facing business information was outdated. Elena grabbed her phone and called information, asking for any Marcus Chen in Los Angeles. There were dozens of listings, and she spent the next 2 hours calling them one by one. Most went to voicemail, a few were clearly the wrong person, and several numbers were disconnected. On the 15th call, an elderly woman answered. "I'm looking for Marcus Chen, the photographer," Elena explained. "He shot my wedding a few years ago, and I'm trying to get in touch with him about some lost photographs." "Oh, honey," the woman said sadly, "are you sure you have the right number? My grandson Marcus isn't a photographer. He's in medical school." Elena apologized and hung up, but something about the woman's voice made her pause. There had been a note of recognition there, as if Marcus Chen, photographer, meant something to her, even if her grandson wasn't the right person. Elena called back. I'm sorry to bother you again, but when I mentioned Marcus Chen, the photographer, you seemed to recognize the name. Do you know who I might be talking about? There was a long pause. Well, she said hesitantly, there was a Marcus who used to take pictures at the community center events. Quiet young man, always very polite. But that was a while back, maybe 2 years ago. I haven't seen him recently. Do you remember which community center? The one on Soto Street in Boyle Heights. They have events for the seniors every month. Bingo, dance classes, cultural celebrations. Marcus used to come and take pictures for their newsletter. Elena's pulse quickened. Boyle Heights was only a few neighborhoods over from where she grew up. It made sense that a photographer trying to build community connections might volunteer his services for local events.
Do you have a contact number for the community center? Hold on, let me get my address book. 20 minutes later, Elena was driving toward Boyle Heights, armed with the address of the Soto Street Community Center and a phone number for someone named Maria Gutierrez, who managed their senior programs. The community center was housed in a converted school building, its Art Deco facade showing signs of age, but maintaining a dignified presence on the busy street. Elena parked in the small lot behind the building and walked through the main entrance, following signs toward the administrative offices. Maria Gutierrez turned out to be a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was cluttered with event flyers, volunteer schedules, and photographs, lots of photographs, covering every available wall space. "You're looking for Marcus Chen?" Maria said when Elena explained her situation. "Oh, yes, I remember Marcus. Lovely young man. He volunteered with us for about a year, taking pictures at our events. He never charged us anything, just asked us to provide the prints for the participants." Elena felt a surge of hope. "Do you have any way to contact him, a phone number or email address?" Maria's expression grew sympathetic. "I'm sorry, dear. Marcus stopped volunteering about 18 months ago. He said he was moving, changing careers, I think. We sent him a thank you card to his last known address, but it came back as undeliverable. Do you still have that address?" Maria hesitated. "I'm not supposed to give out personal information about volunteers." "Please," Elena said, and she could hear the desperation in her own voice. "My mother accidentally destroyed my wedding photos this morning. Marcus was the photographer, and those pictures, they're all I have left of some really important people who aren't here anymore." Something in Elena's tone must have convinced Maria because she pulled out a file folder and rifled through it until she found what she was looking for. Here it is. Marcus Chen, 2847 East 4th Street, Apartment B. But like I said, the mail came back as undeliverable, so he's definitely not there anymore. Elena copied down the address anyway. It wasn't much, but it was something. A place to start, another breadcrumb on the trail that might eventually lead her back to those lost photographs. "The pictures he took here," Elena said, gesturing toward the walls covered with community event photos. "Do you know if he kept copies for himself?" "I assume so. Most photographers do, don't they? For their portfolios or whatever. But I really don't know how to reach him." She paused, studying Elena's face. "Those wedding photos must be very important to you." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. They were important, more important than she'd realized until they were gone. They were proof of a different version of herself, a version that believed in love and forever, and the possibility of happiness. Even if that version had been naive, even if she'd been wrong about David, those feelings had been real at the time. And now that her grandmother was gone, now that her father was gone, now that her marriage had crumbled, those photographs were some of the only evidence she had that there had been moments in her life when everything felt perfect and possible. "Very important," Elena said quietly. As she drove away from the community center, Elena felt the weight of the day settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She'd found traces of Marcus Chen, evidence that he existed, that he'd worked in Los Angeles, that he'd been the kind of person who volunteered his skills to help community organizations document their events.
But traces weren't enough. She needed to find the man himself, needed to locate those digital files, needed to recover at least some of what had been lost in her mother's fire.
The apartment address Maria had given her was in a part of town Elena knew well, a neighborhood where she'd had friends in high school. As she drove through the familiar streets, she found herself remembering who she'd been at 17, full of dreams and ambition, planning to study marketing and maybe work for a big advertising agency, convinced that she could have a career and a family and all the happiness she could imagine. That girl would be so disappointed to see where Elena had ended up, living back in her childhood bedroom at 32, working temp jobs, spending her days hunting through the internet for traces of a photographer who might not even remember her wedding day. But maybe that girl would also understand why these photographs mattered so much. At 17, Elena had believed in the power of documenting important moments, in the idea that some experiences were too precious to trust to memory alone. She'd kept photo albums and journals, collected ticket stubs and concert programs, created elaborate scrapbooks of her high school years. When had she stopped doing that? When had she stopped believing that her life was worth documenting, worth remembering, worth celebrating? Elena pulled up in front of 2847 East 4th Street, a small apartment building with peeling stucco walls and a chain-link fence around a pocket-sized courtyard. The mailboxes by the front entrance were labeled with apartment numbers but no names, and several appeared to be broken or rusted shut. She walked up to apartment B and knocked on the door, though she wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish. If Marcus had moved 18 months ago, the current tenant probably wouldn't know where he'd gone. A young woman answered the door, holding a toddler on her hip. She looked tired but friendly, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her oversized sweater spotted with what looked like baby food. "I'm looking for Marcus Chen. He used to live here, but I think he moved away a while ago." The woman shifted the toddler to her other hip. "Yeah, we've been here about a year. The guy before us left some mail that kept coming for the first few months, but I don't think it was for a Marcus. I think it was like Michael or Miguel, something with an M." Elena's heart sank. Another dead end. Another trail that led nowhere. Did he leave any forwarding address, or did the landlord say where he was moving? "Sorry, I don't know anything about that. We just answered an ad on Craigslist and moved in. The apartment was already empty." As Elena walked back to her car, she felt the futility of her search settling in her chest like a stone. Marcus Chen had vanished as thoroughly as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only a few digital traces and the memory of his quiet professionalism on her wedding day. But as she sat in the driver's seat preparing to head back to her mother's house and another evening of temp job applications and half-hearted job searches, Elena made a decision. She wasn't going to give up, not yet. Those photographs existed somewhere, in cloud storage, on external drives, in whatever digital archive Marcus maintained for his professional work. The fire had destroyed the physical prints, but the original files were still out there, waiting to be found. Elena just had to figure out how to find them. The next morning brought a call that Elena had been dreading. Jennifer, from the temp agency's voice, was clipped and professional, barely containing her annoyance. "Elena, we had you scheduled for a 3-day assignment at Morrison Financial, and you didn't show up yesterday. This is the second time this month you've been a no-show." Elena closed her eyes, sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, surrounded by the detritus of her adult life. Suitcases she'd never fully unpacked, boxes of books from her old apartment, a jewelry box that still held her wedding ring wrapped in tissue paper. "I'm sorry, Jennifer. There was a family emergency." "I understand that emergencies happen, but you need to call ahead. Morrison Financial specifically requested you, based on your previous work with them, and now they're questioning whether our agency can provide reliable candidates." The irony wasn't lost on Elena. Morrison Financial was David's company, or had been before he'd been transferred to their San Francisco office 6 months after the wedding. She'd worked there briefly as a contractor, doing marketing materials and social media management, back when she'd thought she might build a career around David's career, might create a life that complemented his ambitions.
Now, the same company that had once felt like a pathway to her future was offering her temp work, filing insurance claims, and answering phones. The professional woman she'd once been, the one with ideas and creativity and strategic thinking, had been reduced to an unreliable contractor who couldn't even show up on time. "I need this work, Jennifer. Please, give me another chance." There was a long pause. "I'm going to level with you, Elena. Your work quality is excellent when you're actually here, but reliability is just as important. I can put you on the list for fill-in assignments, but I can't guarantee you anything regular until you prove you can be dependable." After Jennifer hung up, Elena sat in the silence of her childhood bedroom, staring at the posters that still hung on her walls. College friends at graduation, a concert poster from a band she'd loved in her early 20s, a photograph of her and her father at her UCLA graduation. All remnants of a different version of herself, a version that had felt capable and directed and optimistic about the future. Her phone buzzed with a text from her college friend, Sarah. "Coffee today? I'm worried about you." Elena almost declined. Sarah worked in marketing for a tech startup, lived in a beautiful apartment in Santa Monica with her partner Lisa, seemed to have everything figured out in a way that made Elena feel like an absolute failure. But Sarah had also been her maid of honor, had been one of the few people to remain completely supportive through Elena's divorce, never once saying, "I told you so," even though she'd had reservations about David from the beginning. "Sure, usual place at 2?" The usual place was a coffee shop in Silver Lake that they'd been meeting at since college, a tiny space with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Elena arrived first, ordering her predictable latte and claiming a corner table where she could spread out her laptop and continue her increasingly desperate search for Marcus Chen. She'd spent the previous evening creating a more systematic approach to her investigation. She'd made lists of every photography association in Los Angeles, every wedding venue where Marcus might have worked, every online forum where professional photographers gathered to discuss technique and business strategies. In one thread, someone had mentioned a Marcus Chen in the context of documentary photography, but when Elena followed the link, it led to a different person entirely, an older man who specialized in architectural photography. Sarah arrived 15 minutes late. As always, her curly red hair pulled back in a messy topknot and her arms full of shopping bags from the vintage stores that lined Sunset Boulevard. Sorry, Sarah said, collapsing into the chair across from Elena with a dramatic sigh. "I found the most incredible 1970s leather jacket, and you know how I get when I find vintage treasures."
Elena smiled despite herself. Sarah's enthusiasm for vintage fashion was legendary among their friend group, and her apartment looked like a museum of mid-century design mixed with contemporary art. It was the kind of aesthetic confidence that Elena had once aspired to, but never quite achieved. "How are you doing?" Sarah asked, her tone shifting to something more serious as she studied Elena's face. "And don't say fine. You look like you haven't slept in days." Elena touched her face self-consciously. She'd applied concealer under her eyes, but apparently not enough to hide the exhaustion that came from staying up until 3 in the morning scrolling through photographer directories and wedding vendor lists. "My mom burned my wedding photos yesterday," Elena said without preamble. Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "She what?" Elena explained about the fire, about Patricia's misguided attempt at protecting her, about the desperate search for Marcus Chen that had consumed the last 24 hours. As she talked, she watched Sarah's expression shift from shock to sympathy to something that looked almost like relief. "Elena," Sarah said gently when the story was finished, "maybe this is actually a good thing." "How can you say that?" Elena's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Those photos were all I had left of what? Of David? Of a marriage that made you miserable for the last year before it ended?" Sarah leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "Honey, you've been carrying those pictures around like a security blanket, like proof that you were once happy. But you can be happy again. You don't need photographs to prove that you're worthy of love." Elena felt her chest tighten with defensive anger. "It's not about David.
There were pictures of my grandmother in that album, pictures of my father walking me down the aisle. Those moments mattered, even if the marriage didn't work out. I know they did. But, Elena, you're talking about this photographer like he's some kind of savior. Like finding these photos is going to fix everything that's wrong with your life right now. Sarah's voice was kind but firm. What happens when you track him down and he doesn't have the files anymore? What happens when you realize that getting those pictures back doesn't actually change anything about where you are today? The question hit Elena like a physical blow, partly because she'd been trying not to think about exactly that possibility. What if Marcus had deleted the files years ago? What if his computer had crashed, or his hard drives had failed, or he simply moved on to other projects and cleared out his old work to make space? I just need to know they exist. I need to know that those moments weren't completely erased. Elena reached across the table and covered Elena's hand with her own. They're not erased. They're in your memory. They're in the memories of everyone who was there. Pictures are just pictures. They're not the actual experience. But Elena pulled her hand away, frustrated by her friend's well-meaning advice. Sarah meant well, but she didn't understand. She'd never lost everything the way Elena had. Her marriage, her home, her sense of identity, her father, her grandmother, and now these photographs that had been her last tangible connection to better times. I have to find him, Elena said stubbornly. I have to at least try. Sarah sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing when Elena had made up her mind about something. Okay, tell me what you've tried so far, and maybe I can help you think of other approaches. Elena pulled out her notebook, showing Sarah the lists she'd compiled, the phone numbers she'd called, the dead ends she'd encountered. As they went through her research together, Sarah's marketing background began to show through her suggestions. Have you tried reaching out to wedding venues directly? If Marcus was shooting weddings regularly, he probably had relationships with event coordinators at the major venues. They might remember him, or at least have his contact information in their vendor files.
It was a good idea, one that Elena hadn't fully explored. She'd been focusing on finding Marcus himself, but approaching it from the vendor network angle might yield better results. Also, Sarah continued, have you tried reverse image searching that Instagram photo you found? Maybe he posted the same image on other platforms. Or maybe someone else shared it and tagged him in a way that would give you current contact information. Elena felt a spark of hope. She'd been so focused on the content of the photograph that she hadn't thought about using it as a search tool itself. They spent the next hour working together, Sarah's laptop joining Elena's on the small coffee shop table, as they systematically searched through venue websites, vendor directories, and social media platforms. Sarah's experience in digital marketing meant she knew search techniques and platforms that Elena had overlooked. The reverse image search on the wedding photo yielded several results: photography blogs that had featured Marcus's work, wedding planning websites that had used the image as an example of candid reception photography, and finally, buried on the third page of results, a link to a photography portfolio website that Elena hadn't seen before. The website was simple, almost austere: black background, white text, a single gallery of images that showcased Marcus's evolution from wedding photography to more artistic documentary work. The photographs were stunning: street portraits that captured raw human emotion, landscapes that found beauty in industrial decay, still life compositions that turned everyday objects into works of art. But more importantly, the website had a contact form and a current email address: dmarcusphotography@gmail.com. That's him, Elena breathed, staring at the screen. That's definitely his style. Look at the way he uses natural light, the composition of these portraits. Sarah peered over Elena's shoulder at the website. The last update was 6 months ago. That's pretty recent. And look, he's based in Los Angeles still, according to the About page. Elena clicked through to Marcus's artist statement, reading about his transition from commercial wedding photography to more personal documentary work. He wrote about finding authenticity in unguarded moments, about the responsibility photographers have to tell truthful stories, about the way images can preserve not just what people looked like, but who they were in specific moments of their lives. "He gets it," Elena said softly. "He understands why photographs matter." Without hesitation, Elena opened the contact form and began typing. "Dear Marcus, my name is Elena Martinez, and you photographed my wedding to David Rodriguez in September 2021 at St. Catherine's Church in Los Angeles. I'm reaching out because my wedding album was accidentally destroyed yesterday, and I'm hoping you might still have the digital files from our shoot. I know this is an unusual request, especially after so many years, but those photographs contained images of family members who have since passed away, and they represent some of my most treasured memories. I'd be happy to pay for your time and any costs associated with retrieving and sending the files. If you no longer have the images, I completely understand. Professional photographers can't keep everything forever, but if there's any chance the files still exist, I would be incredibly grateful for the opportunity to recover even a few of the photographs. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and thank you for the beautiful work you did on my wedding day. Your photographs captured not just how things looked, but how they felt, and that artistry means more to me now than I can express. Sincerely, Elena Martinez." Elena read the message 3 times, editing and refining, trying to strike the right balance between explaining her situation and not overwhelming Marcus with her personal drama. Sarah offered suggestions, helping Elena clarify her request and express appropriate gratitude for Marcus's original work.
When Elena finally hit send, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. Either Marcus would respond and potentially have the files, or he wouldn't respond at all, and Elena would have to accept that this last hope was also a dead end. "Now what?" Sarah asked. "Now I wait, and try not to go crazy checking my email every 5 minutes." But even as Elena said it, she was already refreshing her inbox, hoping for an immediate response that she knew was unlikely to come. They finished their coffee and parted ways with promises that Elena would call as soon as she heard anything. Sarah made Elena promise to keep looking for regular work, to not let this search for the photographs completely derail her efforts to rebuild her life. "The photos aren't going to solve your other problems," Sarah reminded her as they hugged goodbye. "Whatever happens with this Marcus guy, you still need to figure out what you want to do with your life going forward." Elena knew Sarah was right, but she couldn't seem to focus on anything else until she knew whether those digital files still existed. The photographs had become a symbol of something larger, proof that she'd once been capable of happiness, evidence that better times were possible, a connection to the people she'd lost. Driving home through the afternoon traffic, Elena found herself thinking about Marcus's artist statement, about his emphasis on preserving authentic moments and truthful stories. What would he think of her situation? Would he see her search for the photographs as a healthy attempt to preserve meaningful memories, or as an unhealthy fixation on a failed relationship? Back at her mother's house, Elena discovered Patricia in the backyard cleaning out the metal trash can that had held yesterday's fire. The ashes were gone, probably swept up and disposed of, leaving no trace of the wedding album, except for a few small burn marks on the bottom of the can. "Any luck today?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she hoped the answer was no. "Maybe. I found the photographer's current website and sent him an email. Now I just have to wait and see if he responds." Patricia straightened up, wiping her hands on an old dish towel. "Elena, what happens if he doesn't have the pictures anymore? What's your plan then?" It was the same question Sarah had asked, the question Elena had been avoiding because she didn't have a good answer. What would she do if Marcus Chen wrote back to say the files had been deleted years ago? What would she do if he didn't respond at all? "I don't know. I guess I'll figure that out when it happens." But that evening, as Elena sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, refreshing her email every few minutes and jumping every time her phone made a sound, She began to realize that Sarah and her mother might be right about one thing. She was putting too much emotional weight on these photographs, expecting them to solve problems they couldn't actually fix. Even if Marcus still had the files, even if he sent her every single image from her wedding day, Elena would still be a 32-year-old divorced woman living in her childhood bedroom, working temp jobs and struggling to figure out what came next. The photographs might provide comfort, might preserve important memories, but they wouldn't change the fundamental challenges of rebuilding her life. But knowing that intellectually didn't make the waiting any easier. Elena found herself checking her email obsessively, researching Marcus's recent work, even looking up property records to see if she could find his current address. The rational part of her mind recognized that she was becoming obsessed, that this search was starting to feel less like preserving memories and more like avoiding the harder work of moving forward. At 11 p.m. that night, just as Elena was finally getting ready for bed, her email notification chimed. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone, expecting to see Marcus Chen's name in her inbox. Instead, she found a message from an address she didn't recognize. amyc@nsk.com. Elena Martinez, this is Amy Chen, Marcus's sister. Marcus asked me to reach out to you regarding your email about wedding photographs from 2021. We need to talk. Can you call me tomorrow? 323-555-0847. It's complicated. Elena stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the words fully registered. Marcus's sister had responded instead of Marcus, and something about the tone, it's complicated, we need to talk, sent a chill down Elena's spine.
What could be so complicated about a simple request for old wedding photos? Why would Marcus ask his sister to respond instead of writing back himself? Elena's mind immediately went to the darkest possibilities. Maybe Marcus was sick or injured, or worse. Maybe there was some legal issue with the photographs, some reason why he couldn't simply send them if he still had them. Or maybe, Elena thought with growing dread, there was something about her wedding day that she didn't remember. Something that had been captured in those photographs that Marcus felt she needed to be prepared for before seeing the images again. She tried to push down her anxiety and focus on the practical aspects of Amy's message. At least someone in Marcus's family had responded. At least there was a possibility that the files still existed somewhere. Whatever complications Amy was referring to, Elena would deal with them when she understood what they were. But as Elena finally settled into bed, her mother's words echoed in her mind. What happens if he doesn't have the pictures anymore? What's your plan then? Elena was beginning to realize that maybe the more important question was, what happens if he does have them and they contain something she isn't prepared to see? The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Elena's mood as she sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, staring at Amy Chen's number. She'd been awake since 5:30, running through possible scenarios, trying to prepare herself for whatever complicated meant. At 9 o'clock sharp, Elena dialed the number. Amy Chen speaking. Hi, this is Elena Martinez. You emailed me last night about my brother Marcus and some wedding photographs. There was a pause, and Elena could hear traffic in the background, as if Amy was walking outside or sitting in a car. Elena, yes, thank you for calling. Look, I need to ask you some questions before we go any further, okay? This is a sensitive situation. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. Is Marcus okay? Is he sick or hurt or something? No, nothing like that. Marcus is fine physically, but Elena, when you contacted him about your wedding photos, it brought up some things that, well, it's complicated. Can you tell me exactly what happened to your original photographs? Why are you looking for copies now? Elena explained about the fire, about her mother's misguided attempt to help her move on from her divorce, about her desperate search to recover at least some of the images. As she talked, she could hear Amy making small sounds of sympathy and understanding. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That must have been devastating, especially losing the pictures of your grandmother and father. It was. But Amy, what's this about? Why couldn't Marcus respond to me directly? What's so complicated about sending me copies of old wedding photos? Another pause, longer this time. Elena could hear Amy taking a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something difficult. Elena, Marcus doesn't work as a wedding photographer anymore. He hasn't for almost 2 years. He had, let's call it, a crisis of conscience about the industry, about what he was documenting and whether he was always telling the truth in his photographs. Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. What do you mean? Has anyone ever told you that sometimes wedding photographers capture things that the couple doesn't see? Moments that maybe reveal truths about the relationships they're documenting? The knot in Elena's stomach tightened. Amy, what are you trying to tell me?
Elena, Marcus still has your wedding photos. All of them. Digital files, raw images, everything. But before he sends them to you, he wants to make sure you understand what you're asking for. Some of those photographs, they show things that you might not want to see. Things that might have been painful for you to discover at the time. Elena's mind raced, trying to understand what Amy was implying. Things like what? Marcus captured a lot of candid moments during your reception. People when they thought no one was watching. Conversations in corners. Interactions that maybe weren't meant to be seen. Elena, there are photographs in that collection that show your ex-husband with another woman. Intimate photographs. Photographs that would have revealed his infidelity 3 years before you discovered it on your own. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Elena gripped the edge of the kitchen table, feeling like she might be sick. David had been cheating on her during their wedding reception, in front of their family and friends, with enough obvious intimacy that a photographer had accidentally documented it? Who? Elena whispered. Who was he with? I don't know her name. Marcus described her as someone who seemed to know your ex-husband well, someone who was comfortable enough with him to, well, to behave inappropriately at his wedding. She might have been a work colleague or an old friend or I really don't know. Elena's mind flashed through the guest list from her wedding, trying to remember who might have been close enough to David to carry on an affair. There had been several women from his work, college friends, his cousin's wife who had always seemed a little too friendly. But more than the identity of the other woman, Elena was struggling with the implications of what Amy had told her. David hadn't just been unfaithful during their marriage. He'd been unfaithful during their wedding day. While Elena was celebrating what she thought was the beginning of their life together, while she was dancing and laughing and feeling more loved than she'd ever felt in her life, David had been carrying on with another woman mere feet away. Who? Elena whispered. Who was he with? I don't know her name. Marcus described her as someone who seemed to know your ex-husband well, someone who was comfortable enough with him to, well, to behave inappropriately at his wedding. She might have been a work colleague or an old friend or I really don't know. Elena's mind flashed through the guest list from her wedding, trying to remember who might have been close enough to David to carry on an affair. There had been several women from his work, college friends, his cousin's wife, who had always seemed a little too friendly. But more than the identity of the other woman, Elena was struggling with the implications of what Amy had told her. David hadn't just been unfaithful during their marriage. He'd been unfaithful during their wedding day. While Elena was celebrating what she thought was the beginning of their life together, while she was dancing and laughing and feeling more loved than she'd ever felt in her life, David had been carrying on with another woman mere feet away. Marcus has been struggling with this for years, Amy continued gently. Whether he should have told you at the time, whether he should have given you those specific photos, whether he had any right to keep secrets about your own wedding day. It's part of why he stopped shooting weddings altogether. Elena felt tears burning her eyes, but she wasn't sure if they were tears of grief or rage or something more complicated. The photographs she'd been desperately trying to recover weren't just innocent memories.
They were evidence of a betrayal that had been happening right under her nose, documented by a photographer who had been too professional to intervene, but too ethical to simply delete the proof. "I want to see them," Elena said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want to see all of them, including the ones of David and whoever he was with." "Elena, are you sure? Marcus is willing to send you the other photos, the ones of your family, the ceremony, the moments that don't involve your ex-husband's behavior, but he's concerned that seeing the evidence of his infidelity might be more painful than helpful." I've already lived through discovering his affair. I've already been through the divorce, the humiliation, the feeling like an idiot for not seeing the signs. Elena's voice was growing stronger, fueled by an anger she hadn't expected to feel. "I deserve to know the truth about my own wedding day, even if that truth is ugly." Amy was quiet for a long moment. "Okay, I'll talk to Marcus, but Elena, I want you to think about this carefully. Once you see those images, you can't unsee them. They're going to change how you remember that day, and they might make your healing process more difficult. My healing process has been stuck for months anyway. Maybe seeing the truth will actually help me move forward instead of wondering what I missed, what signs I ignored, how long I was naive enough to believe in something that was never real." After Elena hung up the phone, she sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, processing what she'd learned. The wedding photographs she'd been desperately trying to recover weren't just innocent memories. They were evidence of a betrayal that had been happening right under her nose, documented by a photographer who had been too professional to intervene, but too ethical to simply delete the proof. Part of Elena felt vindicated. Her instincts hadn't been completely wrong. There had been something off about David during their engagement and early marriage, something she'd attributed to work stress or wedding pressure or normal relationship adjustments. Now she knew that her subconscious had been picking up on real deception, real evidence of his unfaithfulness. But another part of Elena felt sick with humiliation. How many people at her wedding had known what was happening? How many friends and family members had seen David's behavior and chosen not to tell her? How many candid conversations had there been about the bride's obvious naivete, about David's obvious disrespect? Elena's phone rang, interrupting her spiral of angry thoughts. The caller ID showed Patricia's work number. "Elena? Is everything okay? You sound upset." Elena hadn't realized she'd been crying until she heard the thickness in her own voice. "Mom, can you come home early today? I need to talk to you about something." "What happened? Did you hear from the photographer?" "Yes, but it's complicated. Can you just come home?" Patricia arrived an hour later, still wearing her cleaning clothes and smelling faintly of the industrial disinfectants she used at work. Elena had spent the intervening time pacing the house, alternating between fury at David's betrayal and anticipation about finally seeing the truth of her wedding day documented in photographs. When Elena explained what Amy Chen had told her, Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, protectiveness, and finally a weary sadness that Elena recognized from the months following Elena's father's death. "Mijo," Patricia said softly, settling onto the couch beside Elena and pulling her daughter into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea it went back that far." "Did you see anything that day? Anything that seemed off about David's behavior?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could feel her mother choosing her words carefully. "There were a few moments," Patricia admitted, finally, "when I thought David seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. But Elena, it was your wedding day. I thought maybe he was just nervous or overwhelmed by all the attention. I never imagined." "Who do you think it was? Which woman?" "I don't know, mija. But does it really matter?
David was the one who made vows to you. David was the one who chose to break those vows, apparently from the very beginning. The identity of the other woman doesn't change what he did. Elena knew her mother was right, but she still felt a burning need to know the complete truth, to understand exactly how thorough David's betrayal had been. Had it been someone Elena trusted, someone she'd considered a friend, someone who had smiled and congratulated her while secretly carrying on with her new husband? "Are you going to ask for the photographs?" Elena asked. She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Part of her wanted the evidence, wanted proof that her instincts hadn't been completely wrong. Part of her wanted to understand exactly what had been happening during what she thought was one of the happiest days of her life. But maybe, most importantly, Elena wanted to take back control of her own story. For 3 years, she'd blamed herself for missing the signs of David's infidelity. She'd convinced herself that a better wife, a more observant woman, a smarter person would have seen the truth sooner. Now she was learning that there had been signs, clear, documented, photographic evidence of David's betrayal. The problem hadn't been her intelligence or observational skills. The problem was that she was surrounded by people who chose not to tell her the truth, including a photographer who had captured that truth but kept it to himself.
Elena called Amy Chen back that evening. "I want all the photographs," Elena said without preamble. "The beautiful ones and the ugly ones. Everything Marcus captured that day." "Elena, are you absolutely sure about this?" "I'm sure. I need to know the truth about my own wedding day, even if that truth is painful. I've spent 3 years blaming myself for not seeing David's infidelity sooner. Maybe it's time I stopped blaming myself for things that other people chose to hide from me." Amy sighed. "Okay, Marcus wants to talk to you directly before he sends the files. Not to try to change your mind, but to make sure you understand what you're going to see. Can you meet him tomorrow afternoon?" Elena's pulse quickened. After all these years, she was finally going to meet Marcus Chen again, the quiet photographer who had documented the most important and apparently most devastating day of her adult life. Where and when? "There's a coffee shop called Grounds for Thought on Melrose. Do you know it? Marcus can be there at 3 o'clock tomorrow." "I'll be there." As Elena settled into bed that night, she found herself thinking about the woman in her wedding photographs, whoever she was. Tomorrow, Elena would finally see her face, would finally understand who had been intimate enough with her new husband to carry on with him during their wedding reception. But more than that, tomorrow Elena would finally reclaim the complete truth of her wedding day. For better or worse, she would see what had really been happening while she was celebrating what she thought was the beginning of a faithful marriage. It wouldn't change the past, wouldn't undo the betrayal or the divorce or the months of pain that had followed, but it might finally allow Elena to stop blaming herself for being blind to something that other people had actively hidden from her. And maybe, Elena thought as she finally drifted off to sleep, that understanding might be the first step toward actually moving forward, instead of staying trapped in cycles of self-doubt and regret. Grounds for Thought was exactly the kind of coffee shop Elena would have expected Marcus Chen to choose. Quietly artistic, filled with natural light, walls lined with local photography and indie band posters. Elena arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where she could watch the door and trying to calm her racing heart with deep breathing exercises her therapist had taught her years ago. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind cycling through scenarios of what she might see in those wedding photographs, who the other woman might be, and how extensive David's betrayal had been. Now, sitting in the coffee shop with her hands wrapped around a too-hot latte, Elena felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made her stomach churn. At exactly 3 o'clock, a man Elena immediately recognized as Marcus Chen walked through the front door.
He looked older than she remembered, his black hair touched with premature gray at the temples, his face more lined, but still carrying the same gentle intelligence she recalled from her wedding day. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, carried a worn leather messenger bag, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. Marcus spotted Elena immediately, probably recognizing her despite the years that had passed. As he approached her table, Elena was struck by how different this moment felt from their first meeting. Then she had been a radiant bride, full of joy and excitement about her future. Now she was a divorced woman, seeking evidence of betrayal, wearing yesterday's jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt that had seen better days. "Elena," Marcus said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this is unusual." Up close, Elena could see that Marcus looked tired, as if he had been wrestling with this decision for days. His dark eyes held a combination of sympathy and something that might have been guilt.
"Before we start," Elena said, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for not telling me at the time. You were hired to photograph my wedding, not to be a marriage counselor or investigator. You did your job." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he still looked troubled. "I've thought about that day so many times over the years, whether I should have said something, whether I had any right to interfere. In the end, I decided it wasn't my place to insert myself into your personal life, but I've regretted that decision many times since." "Why did you keep the photographs? If they showed something so problematic, why didn't you just delete them?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Professional photographers are trained to document everything, to capture the complete story of an event, even when parts of that story are uncomfortable. I kept thinking that maybe someday you would want to know the truth, that maybe the evidence would be important for exactly the situation you eventually found yourself in." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean the divorce?" "I mean understanding what really happened in your marriage. Elena, I've shot hundreds of weddings over the years, and I've learned to recognize the signs when relationships are complicated. Your wedding wasn't the first time I'd captured evidence of infidelity, but it was the most extensive documentation I'd ever accidentally created." "Extensive?" Marcus reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a tablet, his movements careful and deliberate. "Before I show you anything, I want you to understand what you're going to see. There are approximately 40 photographs that show your ex-husband in compromising situations with another woman. They span the entire reception, from the cocktail hour through the dancing. It's clear that their interaction wasn't casual or accidental." Elena's mouth felt dry. 40 photographs? "I shoot continuously during receptions, capturing candid moments without people realizing they're being photographed. It's how you get authentic emotions, genuine interactions. But in this case, that approach also documented behavior that your ex-husband probably thought no one was seeing." Marcus turned on the tablet and navigated to a folder labeled "Martinez Wedding Complete Archive." Elena could see hundreds of thumbnail images, far more photographs than had been included in her original wedding album. "I'm going to show you a few of the less explicit images first," Marcus said gently, "so you can see what we're dealing with and decide how much you really want to see." The first photograph appeared on the screen, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. It showed David during the cocktail hour, standing near the bar with his hand on the lower back of a woman Elena immediately recognized, Vanessa Kim, David's colleague from the marketing department, someone Elena had always found a little too friendly but had dismissed as harmless workplace camaraderie. In the photograph, David's hand wasn't just resting on Vanessa's back. It was positioned intimately, possessively, his fingers spread in a way that suggested familiarity and ownership. Vanessa was leaning into him, her face turned up toward his with an expression of unmistakable intimacy. "Oh my God," Elena whispered. "Vanessa, I invited her to my wedding." "You knew her?" "She worked with David. They always seemed close.
But David said they were just friends, said she was like a little sister to him. I felt guilty for being jealous of her. I thought I was being paranoid and possessive. Marcus swiped to the next photograph, taken later during the cocktail hour. This time, David and Vanessa were partially hidden behind one of the floral arrangements, but Marcus's telephoto lens had captured them clearly. David's hand was now on Vanessa's waist, and she was whispering something in his ear that made him smile in a way Elena remembered from their early dating days. They look like... Elena stopped, unable to finish the sentence.
They look like a couple, Marcus said gently. Like people who are comfortable being intimate with each other. Elena stared at the image, remembering that moment from her own perspective. She had been across the room, accepting congratulations from her college friends, glowing with happiness and champagne and the certainty that she was beginning the most wonderful chapter of her life. Meanwhile, her new husband had been carrying on with another woman 20 feet away. How many people saw this? I can't answer that definitively, but Elena, based on what I observed that day, their behavior wasn't exactly subtle. I suspect that several of your guests noticed something inappropriate, even if they didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. Marcus showed her 3 more photographs from the cocktail hour, each one more damning than the last. In one, David was feeding Vanessa a piece of wedding cake before the official cake-cutting ceremony. In another, they were dancing together during what was supposed to be family photos, their bodies pressed close in a way that was unmistakably sexual. The wedding party photos, Elena said suddenly, remembering something that had puzzled her at the time. Vanessa kept disappearing during the formal photos, and David kept making excuses to step away too. I thought he was just nervous about being the center of attention. They were stepping away together, Marcus confirmed. I have photographs of them in the church garden, in the parking lot, even in what appears to be an empty classroom in the church building. Elena felt like she was going to be sick. The scope of David's betrayal was so much larger than she'd imagined, so much more blatant and disrespectful. While Elena had been posing for formal family portraits, while she had been graciously accepting gifts and well wishes from their guests, David had been conducting what amounted to a parallel relationship with another woman. "Show me the rest," Elena said, though her voice was barely a whisper. Over the next hour, Marcus guided Elena through the complete photographic record of her wedding reception. What emerged was a devastating portrait of a man who had never intended to be faithful to his marriage vows, not even on the day he spoke them. The photographs showed David and Vanessa stealing moments throughout the evening, during Elena's father's speech, during the bouquet toss, during the traditional last dance between Elena and her new husband. In every image, their body language spoke of an intimacy that had clearly been developing for months or years. But more painful than David's betrayal was the evidence of Elena's own obliviousness. In several shots, Elena could be seen in the background, smiling and laughing, completely unaware of what was happening mere feet away from her. In one particularly devastating image, Elena was cutting the wedding cake with David while Vanessa was standing directly behind them, her hand resting possessively on David's shoulder. "I look so happy," Elena said, staring at her own radiant face in the photographs. "So completely clueless." "You look like a woman celebrating her wedding day," Marcus corrected gently. "You had every reason to trust your husband and expect fidelity. The fact that he was violating that trust wasn't something you should have been looking for." Elena appreciated Marcus's kindness, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she should have seen something, should have noticed the way David's attention was divided, should have questioned why Vanessa seemed to be everywhere during their reception. "Did anyone say anything to you about what they were seeing?" Marcus shook his head. "A few people asked me about photographing the other couple who seemed to be having their own celebration. I think some guests assumed Vanessa was David's sister or cousin, that there was some family relationship that explained their closeness." "What about my family? My friends? I can't speak to what they saw or understood, but Elena, people tend to see what they expect to see at weddings.
Everyone was focused on celebrating you and David, not analyzing his interactions with other guests. And honestly, most people probably gave David the benefit of the doubt because it was his wedding day. Elena found herself thinking about her conversations with friends and family in the weeks following the wedding. Had there been hints? Careful questions? Attempts to gauge whether Elena was aware of David's behavior? She couldn't remember anything specific, but then again, she had been floating on post-wedding bliss, interpreting everything through the lens of her own happiness. Marcus showed her the final set of photographs, taken during the last hour of the reception. By this point, David and Vanessa weren't even trying to hide their intimacy. They were dancing together during songs meant for Elena and David, their faces close enough to kiss, their hands wandering in ways that were absolutely inappropriate for a wedding reception. In the most damning photograph of all, taken just an hour before Elena and David's departure for their honeymoon, David was kissing Vanessa goodbye in what appeared to be a hallway outside the reception hall. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a passionate, lingering kiss that spoke of promises to continue their relationship while David was supposedly honeymooning with his new wife. "He kissed her goodbye," Elena said, staring at the image with a mixture of devastation and rage. "Before leaving for our honeymoon, he kissed another woman goodbye." Marcus closed the tablet gently. "Elena, I want you to know that I struggled with whether to show you these images, but I also think you deserve to understand what really happened that day, especially since you've spent years blaming yourself for not seeing signs that were actively being hidden from you." Elena sat in silence for several minutes, processing what she'd seen. The wedding day she'd remembered as perfect and magical had actually been an elaborate performance, with David playing the role of devoted husband while simultaneously conducting an affair in full view of their family and friends. But strangely, alongside the pain and humiliation, Elena felt something unexpected: relief. For 3 years, she'd tortured herself with questions about what she'd missed, what signs she had ignored, how she could have been so blind to David's true character. Now she knew the truth. There had been signs, clear and obvious signs, but David had been skillful enough to keep them from her direct view. "I want copies of all the photographs," Elena said finally. "Not just these ones, but everything from that day. I want the complete record." "Are you sure? Some of these images are going to be painful to have." "I'm sure. For 3 years, I've been living with an incomplete understanding of my own wedding day. I've been blaming myself for not being smart enough or observant enough to see David's infidelity. But I wasn't stupid. I was being deceived by someone who was very good at deception." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll prepare a complete digital archive for you. Elena, I want you to know that your responses to these photographs, your strength, your clarity about what happened, those reactions tell me a lot about who you are as a person. David's behavior reflects on his character, not yours." As Marcus prepared to transfer the files to a cloud storage account Elena could access, Elena found herself thinking about all the people who had been at her wedding that day. Her parents, her grandmother, her college friends, David's family, all of them witnesses to what Marcus's camera had captured, yet none of them had said anything to her. "Marcus, in your professional opinion, how many people do you think noticed David's behavior?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Based on what I observed, I'd say at least a dozen people saw enough to raise questions. Maybe more. But, Elena, people make assumptions at weddings. They assume the best about the bride and the groom. They don't want to create drama on what's supposed to be a happy day. And they often convince themselves they're misinterpreting what they're seeing."
"Or they're cowards," Elena said bitterly. "They'd rather let someone live in ignorance than deal with the uncomfortable truth." Maybe. Or maybe they genuinely didn't know how to handle what they were seeing. It's one thing to notice inappropriate behavior, but it's another thing entirely to decide you should intervene in someone else's marriage on their wedding day. Helena understood the logic, but she still felt betrayed by the silence of everyone who had witnessed David's infidelity. How many conversations had there been after the wedding? How many people had gone home, shaking their heads, feeling sorry for the naive bride who had no idea what her new husband was really like. "There's something else," Marcus said hesitantly. "Something I discovered when I was preparing these files for you." Elena's stomach clenched. "What?" "I did some research on Vanessa Kim after your email brought all this back up. Elena, she's married now. Has been for about 2 years. She married David." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. David married Vanessa? They had a small ceremony in Napa Valley in 2023. I found the announcement in the San Francisco Chronicle Society pages. Elena stared at Marcus, trying to process this information. David hadn't just had an affair with Vanessa, he'd left Elena for Vanessa, had married the same woman who had been groping him during Elena's wedding reception. "So their relationship continued after my wedding," Elena said slowly. "The whole time David and I were married, he was planning to leave me for her?" "It appears that way, yes." Elena felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with deep hurt. She'd been right to feel threatened by Vanessa, right to sense that something was off about David's relationship with his work friend. But she'd been gaslit into thinking her concerns were jealousy and insecurity, trained to apologize for having normal reactions to obviously inappropriate behavior. "I need to see their wedding announcement." Marcus hesitated. "Elena, are you sure that's a good idea? You've already seen enough painful truth for one day." But Elena was already pulling out her phone, searching for David Rodriguez and Vanessa Kim wedding announcement. The article appeared immediately, complete with professional engagement photos that made Elena's chest tighten with recognition. There was David, smiling at Vanessa with the same expression he'd worn in Elena's engagement photos 3 years earlier. There was Vanessa, radiant in a way that reminded Elena painfully of her own pre-wedding happiness. The announcement described their whirlwind romance and mentioned that they'd found love unexpectedly after David's previous marriage ended. "Whirlwind romance," Elena read out loud, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Unexpected love. What a load of bullshit."
But what struck Elena most was the photograph accompanying the announcement. David and Vanessa looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love, in a way that reminded Elena of her own wedding photos. Were those expressions real, or was David simply a skilled enough actor to perform love convincingly for any audience? "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I probably should have prepared you for that information more carefully." Elena looked up from her phone, surprised to find that she wasn't crying. The revelation that David had married his wedding day mistress should have devastated her, but instead it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Actually, I think I needed to know this," Elena said. "It explains so much about why our marriage felt off from the beginning, why David always seemed distracted, why he was never fully present even during our supposedly romantic moments." Elena thought back to their honeymoon, to the way David had seemed restless and preoccupied even while they were exploring Paris together. She'd attributed his mood to work stress and post-wedding exhaustion, but now she understood that he'd probably been thinking about Vanessa, missing Vanessa, maybe even communicating with Vanessa while Elena was trying to celebrate their new marriage. "The photos from our honeymoon," Elena said suddenly. "David was constantly on his phone, but he said it was work emergencies. He was probably texting her the whole time." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "It's possible. Elena, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to remember that none of this is a reflection of your worth or intelligence. David made a choice to live a double life, and he was apparently very skilled at deception." As Elena prepared to leave the coffee shop, armed with access to the complete photographic record of her wedding day, she found herself thinking about the woman she'd been 3 years ago. That Elena had been trusting, optimistic, willing to believe the best about the people she loved. This Elena was wiser but sadder, more cynical but also more realistic about human nature. "Marcus," Elena said as they stood to leave, "why did you really keep these photographs all these years? The honest reason." Marcus was quiet for a moment, shouldering his messenger bag and looking out at the busy street beyond the coffee shop windows. "Because I've seen what secrets do to people," he said finally. "I've watched families torn apart by lies that could have been addressed if someone had been brave enough to tell the truth earlier. I kept your photos because I thought someday you might need proof that your instincts weren't wrong, that the problems in your marriage weren't your fault. Elena felt tears threatening for the first time since seeing the photographs. Thank you for keeping them, for showing them to me, for helping me understand what really happened. What will you do now? Elena considered the question as they walked toward the parking lot. What would she do with this new understanding of her wedding day, her marriage, her ex-husband's character? The photographs didn't change the fact that she was 32 and divorced and living in her childhood bedroom. They didn't solve her employment problems or help her figure out what direction her life should take next. But they did solve one crucial problem that had been holding her back: the question of whether she could trust her own judgment. For 3 years, Elena had doubted her instincts, questioned her intelligence, wondered if she was the kind of person who was destined to be deceived by the people she loved. Now she knew better. She hadn't been naive or stupid. She'd been deliberately misled by someone who was skilled at manipulation and deception. Her instincts about Vanessa were correct. Her sense that something was wrong in her marriage had been accurate. Her growing conviction that David was hiding something from her had been absolutely right.
I think, Elena said slowly, I'm going to stop blaming myself for not seeing things that were being hidden from me. And I'm going to figure out what I actually want my life to look like, instead of defining myself by what went wrong in my marriage. Marcus smiled. The first genuine smile Elena had seen from him since he'd walked into the coffee shop. That sounds like a very good plan. As Elena drove home through the afternoon traffic, she found herself thinking about her mother's fire in a new light. Patricia had burned the wedding album in an attempt to help Elena move forward, to stop her from dwelling on a relationship that had caused so much pain. But the fire had actually led Elena to a much more complete understanding of that relationship, an understanding that might finally allow her to truly move forward. The photographs on Marcus's tablet weren't beautiful memories. They were evidence of betrayal, documentation of deception, proof that Elena's marriage had been built on lies from the very beginning. But they were also proof that Elena's instincts were sound, that her intelligence was intact, that she could trust herself to recognize truth when she saw it. When Elena arrived home, she found Patricia in the kitchen preparing dinner, the same simple meal of rice and beans that had comforted Elena throughout her childhood. "How did it go with the photographer?" Patricia asked, studying Elena's face carefully. Elena sat down at the kitchen table and told her mother everything about Marcus's careful documentation of David's infidelity, about Vanessa's identity, about the revelation that David had married his wedding day mistress. As Elena talked, she watched Patricia's expression shift from shock to anger to a protective fury that reminded Elena of her mother's reaction to schoolyard bullies when Elena was young. "That bastard," Patricia said when Elena finished. "That absolute bastard. And that woman coming to your wedding, accepting your hospitality, carrying on with your husband right in front of everyone. The worst part is that I invited her. I felt sorry for her because she didn't have a date, so I made sure she was seated at a good table, made sure she felt included in the celebration. I was literally facilitating their affair." Patricia reached across the table and took Elena's hands in her own. "Mija, you were being kind. You were being generous and welcoming the way I raised you to be. The fact that they took advantage of your kindness says everything about their character and nothing about yours." Elena felt some of the tension in her chest begin to ease. "I keep thinking about all the people who must have seen what was happening, all the people who chose not to tell me." "People are complicated, Elena. Some of them were probably cowards, yes, but some of them probably genuinely didn't know what to do with what they were seeing. It's easy to judge them now, but in the moment, at a wedding with everyone trying to be polite and celebratory, I can understand why they hesitated." Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready to forgive the silence of her wedding guests. Still, she was beginning to understand that she couldn't control other people's choices. She could only control her own response to the truth she now possessed. "I want to do something with the photographs," Elena said. "Not display them or anything like that, but use them somehow.
Maybe write about the experience or find a way to help other people who've been gaslit in their relationships? Patricia smiled. That sounds like the Elena I raised. The one who organized the neighborhood watch, who tutored struggling students in high school, who's always wanted to help people. That night, Elena sat in her childhood bedroom with her laptop, looking through the complete archive of her wedding photographs that Marcus had shared with her. The beautiful images were still beautiful. Her grandmother's proud tears, her father's awkward but heartfelt speech, the genuine joy of friends and family celebrating what they thought was a love story.
But now Elena could see those images alongside the evidence of David's betrayal, could understand the complete truth of that day instead of the edited version she'd been living with for 3 years. It was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time since her divorce, Elena felt like she had a complete understanding of what had happened in her marriage. Not just the affair she discovered 3 years later, but the systematic deception that had been present from the very beginning. Elena pulled out a notebook and began writing. The wedding photos my mother burned weren't just memories, they were evidence. Evidence of betrayal, yes, but also evidence that my instincts were right, that my intelligence was intact, that I wasn't the naive fool I'd convinced myself I was. For the first time in months, Elena felt like she had something important to say, something that might help other people who were questioning their own judgment after being deceived by someone they trusted. The photographs Marcus had preserved weren't just documentation of her personal tragedy, but they were proof that people could trust their instincts, that gaslighting was real, that being deceived didn't make someone stupid or weak. As Elena continued writing, she found herself thinking about the future in a way she hadn't in months. Not a future defined by what she'd lost, but a future shaped by what she'd learned, what she had survived, what wisdom she had gained from her experience. The wedding photographs would never be beautiful memories for Elena, but they might be something even more valuable. The foundation for a life built on truth instead of illusion, on self-trust instead of self-doubt, on the understanding that some experiences, however painful, could be transformed into something meaningful and helpful for others. 3 months after Elena's meeting with Marcus Chen, she was sitting in a different coffee shop, this one in Pasadena, across from Rebecca Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who had responded to Elena's blog post about wedding day gaslighting with a story that made Elena's heart ache. "I kept thinking I was crazy," Rebecca was saying, stirring sugar into her tea with shaking hands. "Everyone kept telling me how perfect my husband was, how lucky I was to have found such a devoted man. But I could feel something was wrong. I just couldn't prove it." Elena nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern. Since she'd started writing about her experience with Marcus's photographs, Elena had been contacted by dozens of women with similar stories. Marriages that felt off from the beginning, instincts that were dismissed as paranoia, evidence that was explained away by skilled manipulators. "The hardest part," Elena said gently, "is learning to trust yourself again after someone has systematically convinced you that your perceptions are wrong." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, exactly. Even now, 2 years after my divorce, I second-guess everything I feel, everything I notice. I'm terrified of being wrong again." Elena's blog, The Truth in the Frame, had started as a simple way to process her own experience. She had written about the wedding photographs, about the revelation of David's betrayal, about the journey from self-doubt to self-understanding. But the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from people who had experienced similar gaslighting, similar systematic deception, similar struggles to trust their own judgment. What had begun as personal therapy had evolved into something larger. Elena now spent her mornings writing articles about recognizing manipulation, about rebuilding confidence after emotional abuse, about the importance of documenting one's own experience when facing systematic gaslighting. Her afternoons were often filled with coffee meetings like this one.
Informal conversations with readers who needed someone to validate their experiences and remind them that their perceptions were real. "I want to show you something," Elena said, pulling out her phone and navigating to a folder she'd created specifically for these conversations. "This is from my wedding day." She showed Rebecca one of Marcus's photographs. Not one of the damaging images of David and Vanessa, but a picture of Elena herself during the reception, smiling brightly while talking to a group of David's colleagues. In the background, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, David could be seen with his hand on Vanessa's waist. "See how happy I look?" Elena pointed to her own radiant expression. "I wasn't faking that happiness. I genuinely felt joyful in that moment, but I was also completely unaware of what was happening literally 20 feet behind me." Rebecca studied the photograph intently. "You couldn't have known to look for that." "Exactly. And that's what I need you to understand about your own situation. When someone is deliberately deceiving you, when they're skilled at manipulation and presentation, your failure to detect their deception isn't a failure of intelligence or intuition. It's evidence of their skill at lying, not evidence of your inability to see truth." This had become Elena's central message, the theme that ran through all her writing and conversations. The difference between being naive and being deliberately misled. For too long, Elena had blamed herself for not seeing David's infidelity sooner, had convinced herself that a smarter or more observant woman would have caught the signs. But Marcus's photographs had shown her something crucial. There had been signs, clear and obvious signs, but David had been careful to keep them away from Elena's direct line of sight. He'd conducted his affair in the spaces between Elena's attention, in moments when she was distracted by other conversations or focused on her duties as a host. "The gaslighting started long before I discovered the affair," Elena continued, showing Rebecca another photograph. "David convinced me that my concerns about Vanessa were jealousy and insecurity. He made me apologize for having normal reactions to obviously inappropriate behavior. By the time I found evidence of his cheating 3 years later, I was so trained to doubt my own perceptions that I almost convinced myself I was overreacting to hotel receipts and secret text messages." Rebecca nodded vigorously. "That's exactly what happened to me. My ex-husband had such reasonable explanations for everything that seemed off. Working late became normal, weekend business trips became normal, phone calls he had to take in private became normal. I started to think I was becoming a paranoid, jealous wife." "But you weren't paranoid," Elena said firmly. "You were responding appropriately to real evidence that something was wrong. The problem wasn't your perceptions. The problem was that he was very good at hiding the truth and making you question your own sanity." Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Still on for dinner tonight? Lisa's making her famous lasagna, and we want to hear about your latest meetings." Elena smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Her friendships had deepened considerably since she'd started doing this work. Sarah and Lisa had become regular supporters of her blog, helping with technical aspects of website management and occasionally contributing guest posts about recognizing emotional manipulation in relationships. But more importantly, Elena's relationships with everyone in her life had become more honest and direct. She had had difficult conversations with several wedding guests who had witnessed David's behavior but remained silent. Conversations that had been painful but ultimately clarifying about who could be trusted with truth and who prioritized politeness over honesty.
"I've been thinking about starting a support group," Elena told Rebecca as they prepared to leave the coffee shop. "Something for people who are recovering from gaslighting relationships, learning to trust their instincts again." Rebecca's face lit up. "I would love something like that. Individual therapy has been helpful, but there's something different about talking to people who really understand what it feels like to doubt your own sanity." Elena had been considering this idea for weeks. Her blog reached people all over the country, but there was something to be said for in-person community, for the kind of support that could only come from sitting in a room with other people who had survived similar experiences. "Let me work on the logistics," Elena said.
I'll email you when I have details. As Elena drove home from Pasadena, she found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since that morning when Patricia had burned her wedding album. At the time, the fire had felt like the final loss in a series of devastations: her marriage, her home, her sense of identity, and then her last tangible connection to better times. But that fire had also set in motion a chain of events that had led Elena to a more complete understanding of her own story, and ultimately to a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since college. The blog was bringing in enough income through sponsorships and speaking engagements that Elena had been able to move out of her mother's house and into a small apartment near downtown Los Angeles. Nothing fancy, but it was hers, decorated with furniture she'd chosen herself and artwork that reflected her own taste rather than compromise with a partner. More importantly, Elena was beginning to recognize herself again. Not the naive bride from her wedding photographs, but not the broken woman who had moved back into her childhood bedroom either. This version of Elena was harder won, more realistic about human nature, but also more confident in her ability to navigate difficult truths. Elena's phone rang as she pulled into her apartment parking lot. The caller ID showed her mother's number. "How did the meeting go today?" Patricia asked without preamble. "Good. Rebecca is thinking about law school, actually. She said reading my blog made her realize she wants to help other people who are being financially manipulated by their partners." Patricia had become one of Elena's most enthusiastic supporters, proud of her daughter's transformation from heartbroken divorcee to advocate for people recovering from emotional manipulation. She'd even started sharing Elena's articles with the women she worked with, several of whom had their own stories of relationships that had made them question their own perceptions. "I have news," Patricia said, and Elena could hear excitement in her voice. "I got a call from a producer at Channel 7. They want to do a segment about your blog for their morning show, something about helping people recognize gaslighting before it gets too serious." Elena's heart raced. Local television coverage could significantly expand her reach, could help her connect with people who might not have found her blog otherwise. But it also meant going public with her story in a much more visible way, meant potentially dealing with criticism or pushback from people who didn't understand the complexities of emotional manipulation. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd have you call them back." "Elena, this could be really good for what you're trying to do. Think about how many people you could help." As Elena climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, she thought about the woman she had been a year ago, so paralyzed by self-doubt that she could barely function at temp jobs. That woman would never have considered going on television to discuss her personal experience with betrayal and gaslighting. But this Elena had spent months rebuilding her confidence, had received dozens of messages from people thanking her for helping them trust their own instincts, and had learned that her experience could be transformed into something valuable for others. "I'll call them tomorrow," Elena told her mother. Elena's apartment was small but filled with light. The walls lined with bookshelves and the photographs she'd actually chosen to keep. Pictures of her grandmother, her father.
Elena stepped out into the bright Los Angeles morning, the smell of smoke still clinging to her clothes, her mother's worried voice calling after her from the doorway. She didn't know what she would find at Chen Photography, didn't know if Marcus would even remember her wedding from 3.5 years ago, didn't know if the files still existed. But she had to try. Those photographs represented more than just her failed marriage. They represented a day when she had felt beautiful and loved and hopeful about the future. They represented her grandmother's proud tears, her college friends' joyful faces, her father's awkward but heartfelt speech at the reception. They represented a version of herself that she wasn't ready to let disappear completely into ash and regret. As Elena drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past the corner market where she'd bought candy as a child, past the park where she played soccer in high school, past all the landmarks of a life that felt simultaneously hers and foreign, she found herself thinking about Marcus Chen. She remembered how he'd moved through her wedding day like a shadow, capturing moments without intruding on them, how he'd seemed to understand the weight of what he was documenting. Professional photographers were artists, weren't they? They understood the value of images, the way a single photograph could contain entire stories, entire worlds. Maybe he would understand why these pictures mattered to her, why they were worth fighting for even after everything had fallen apart. The morning traffic was light as Elena made her way toward downtown, the industrial district spreading out before her like a maze of converted warehouses and artist studios. She found Industrial Avenue easily enough, but as she drove slowly down the street, searching for number 1247, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. Half the buildings looked abandoned, their windows boarded up or broken. Several bore for lease signs that had clearly been there for years, the paint faded and peeling. The arts district that had seemed so vibrant and promising a few years ago now looked like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. When Elena finally found 1247, her heart sunk completely. The building was clearly empty, its windows dark, a large space available banner stretched across the front entrance. She parked anyway, walking up to peer through the grimy windows, hoping against hope that she might see some sign of life inside. The space was completely vacant, nothing but concrete floors and exposed pipes, industrial lighting fixtures hanging like dead flowers from the ceiling. There was no trace that Chen Photography had ever existed here, no forwarding address, no clue about where Marcus might have gone. Elena stood there for a long moment, staring into the empty space, feeling the last flicker of hope die in her chest. Of course it was too late. Of course Marcus was long gone, probably moved to a different city or given up photography altogether. Of course her mother's fire had destroyed the last copies of those images, leaving nothing but ash and regret. But as Elena turned to walk back to her car, she noticed something that made her pause. Painted on the brick wall beside the entrance, almost hidden by years of weather and graffiti, was a small logo, a stylized camera with MC Photo written beneath it in elegant script. Marcus Chen. MC Photo. He had been here. The evidence was faint but real, like a ghost's signature on a wall. Elena pulled out her phone and searched for MC Photo Los Angeles, scrolling through results that led to dead links and expired domains. She tried Marcus Chen Photographer and found a few old wedding listings, but nothing current, nothing that would help her track him down. Standing in that empty parking lot, surrounded by the ruins of the arts district, Elena felt the full weight of her losses crashing down on her. Her marriage, her home, her sense of self, and now these photographs. All of it gone, all of it irretrievable. The fire her mother had lit in the backyard seemed to be spreading, consuming everything Elena had once thought permanent and precious. But somewhere in the depths of her despair, a small voice whispered that maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe Marcus Chen was still out there somewhere, still keeping digital files in cloud storage or external drives. Maybe professional ethics or simple sentimentality had kept them from deleting those wedding photos, even after all these years.
Elena, this is Marcus. I've been following your blog since you started it, and I want you to know how proud I am of the work you're doing. You've taken one of the most painful experiences imaginable and transformed it into something that helps other people. That takes incredible strength and wisdom. I also want you to know that your writing has changed how I approach my own work. I'm back to shooting weddings occasionally, but now I'm much more intentional about creating opportunities for honest conversations with couples about what they want their photos to represent. I've learned to see my role not just as a documentarian, but as someone who might be in a position to preserve truth for people who might need it later. Thank you for teaching me that photography can be about more than capturing beautiful moments. Sometimes it's about preserving evidence that people can trust their own perceptions. Keep writing. Keep helping people see clearly. Elena stared at the comment for a long time, feeling a mixture of gratitude and validation. Marcus had become an unexpected ally in her journey toward understanding, and now he was using his own professional platform to support other people in similar situations. As Elena prepared for bed in her quiet apartment, she found herself thinking about the woman she'd been on her wedding day. Hopeful, trusting, full of dreams about the future. That woman had been naive about David specifically, but she hadn't been wrong about the possibility of love, partnership, and happiness.
Elena was beginning to understand that maybe the goal wasn't to become someone completely different from her pre-divorce self. Maybe the goal was to become a more complete version of herself, someone who retained her capacity for love and trust, while also developing better skills for recognizing deception and protecting her own emotional well-being. The wedding photographs that had once represented her greatest failure now felt like evidence of her resilience. She had survived systematic gaslighting, had rebuilt her sense of self from the ground up, had transformed her personal pain into something that helped other people. Elena still kept one photograph from her wedding day on her desk, the picture of herself dancing with her father. But now she also kept a photo from the previous month, taken at a speaking engagement where she'd addressed a group of therapists about recognizing gaslighting in their clients' relationships. In that recent photograph, Elena looked confident and purposeful, someone who had something important to say and the skills to say it clearly. It was a reminder that identity wasn't fixed, that people could grow and change and become stronger through even the most painful experiences. As Elena drifted off to sleep, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow's phone call with the television producer, to the support group she was planning to start, to the book proposal she was outlining based on her blog posts. For the first time in years, Elena's future felt full of possibility, not because she'd forgotten the past, but because she'd finally understood it completely. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. And now, that truth was becoming the foundation for a life built on authenticity, purpose, and the hard-won knowledge that she could trust herself to navigate whatever came next. 5 years later, Elena stood in the green room of the national television studio, checking her appearance one final time before her interview on Good Morning America. Her reflection showed a woman transformed, not just by professional styling and makeup, but by the quiet confidence that came from years of speaking truth and helping others find their voices.
The book in her hands, The Truth in the Frame, Recognizing and Recovering from Gaslighting, had become a bestseller 6 months after its publication. What had started as a personal blog post about wedding photography had evolved into a comprehensive guide for people recovering from emotional manipulation, complete with practical exercises, warning signs to watch for, and strategies for rebuilding self-trust. "Ms. Martinez?" A production assistant appeared at her elbow. "We're ready for you." Elena nodded, taking a deep breath and thinking about all the people who had reached out to her over the years, the women and men who had learned to trust their instincts again, the therapists who used her work with their clients, the wedding photographers who had started having different conversations with their couples about documentation and truth. The interview went smoothly, Elena's years of practice with media appearances evident in her clear, compassionate responses to the host's questions. She talked about the morning her mother had burned her wedding photos, about the photographer who had preserved evidence of her husband's betrayal, about the journey from self-doubt to advocacy. "What would you say to someone who's just beginning to question whether their perceptions are accurate?" the host asked as the segment neared its end. Elena looked directly into the camera, thinking of Rebecca, who had indeed gone to law school and was now practicing family law, specializing in cases involving financial manipulation. She thought of Marcus, who had become an official consultant for her foundation, helping train other photographers to recognize signs of abusive relationships. She thought of the hundreds of people who had attended her workshops, joined her support groups, found their way back to trusting themselves. "I would say that if something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, even if you can't prove it yet. Your instincts are valid, your perceptions matter, and the fact that someone else can't see what you're seeing doesn't mean you're imagining it. It might just mean you're seeing something they're not in a position to see." After the interview, Elena took a taxi across town to her office in Midtown Manhattan. The Truth in the Frame Foundation now occupied a full floor of a renovated brownstone, housing support groups, educational workshops, and a research center that studied the long-term effects of gaslighting relationships. Elena's assistant Jordan met her at the elevator with a stack of messages and a knowing smile. "The phones have been ringing nonstop since your interview aired. The website crashed twice from traffic. And there's someone here to see you. Says it's personal."
In Elena's office, sitting in the comfortable chair reserved for one-on-one meetings, was a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and nervous energy. She looked familiar in a way that made Elena's chest tighten with recognition. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Sarah Kim, Vanessa Kim's younger sister." Elena felt her breath catch. In 5 years of public speaking and media appearances, no one from David's family or social circle had ever contacted her. Elena had sometimes wondered what had become of David and Vanessa, whether their marriage had lasted, whether they'd had children, whether they'd ever felt any guilt about how their relationship had begun. "Please, sit," Elena said, settling into her own chair and trying to read Sarah's expression. "What can I do for you?" Her hands twisted in her lap.